The small town of Millbrook, Tennessee in 1952 had two unwritten rules that everyone knew by heart. Never question Pastor Edmund Hartley's judgment, and never, ever associate with Rachel Brennan. When Thomas Caldwell, the town's most eligible bachelor and the pastor's right-hand man, announced he intended to court the so-called cursed widow instead of marrying the pastor's radiant daughter, Catherine, the scandal that followed would split the community down the middle. But what Thomas discovered about Rachel's past, and what Rachel would eventually reveal about her own fears, would challenge everything Millbrook believed about judgment, redemption, and the true meaning of faith. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Caldwell had never been a man who sought attention, yet attention found him regardless. At 32, he was Millbrook's most successful contractor, having built half the new homes that dotted the expanding suburbs on the eastern edge of town. His reputation for honest work, fair pricing, and meticulous craftsmanship had made him wealthy by local standards. Though he lived modestly in a renovated farmhouse 3 miles from the town center, more than his professional success, Thomas was known for his steadfast involvement in Millbrook Community Church. He'd been raised in its pews, baptized in its waters, and had served in virtually every capacity a layman could serve. He led the men's Bible study on Tuesday evenings, managed the building maintenance committee, organized the annual missions fundraiser, and could be counted on to arrive early and leave late for any church function that required an extra pair of hands. Pastor Edmund Hartley had taken a particular interest in Thomas since the young man's father, Robert Caldwell, had passed away 4 years earlier. Robert had been one of the church's founding deacons, a pillar of spiritual integrity whose sudden heart attack had devastated the congregation. In the wake of that loss, Pastor Hartley had stepped naturally into a mentoring role, guiding Thomas through his grief, while also cultivating what he saw as the young man's leadership potential. "You have your father's character," the pastor had told him during one of their regular Thursday afternoon meetings in the church office. "The same integrity, the same commitment to doing what's right, regardless of personal cost. Millbrook needs men like you, Thomas. Men who will stand firm when culture tries to erode biblical principles." Thomas had always felt the weight of these expectations, the sense that he was meant to be an example to others. It wasn't a burden he'd asked for, but neither was it one he shirked. If his life of discipline and service could encourage others toward faith, then the personal sacrifices seemed worthwhile. The personal sacrifices had been considerable. While his former high school classmates had married young and started families, Thomas had remained single, pouring his energy into his business and his church commitments. It wasn't that he lacked interest in marriage. He simply hadn't found anyone who seemed to share his values deeply enough to build a life together. The few relationships he'd attempted had faltered when the women involved grew frustrated with the amount of time he dedicated to church activities, or when they made clear they expected a lifestyle his modest spending habits wouldn't support. Pastor Hartley had begun making increasingly pointed suggestions about Catherine, his daughter, over the past year. The comments started subtly. Observations about what a wonderful helpmeet she would make for the right man. Mentions of her musical talents and her heart for ministry. Casual remarks about how she'd been asking about Thomas's favorite hymns or his views on various theological questions. Catherine Hartley was objectively beautiful. At 26, she possessed her mother's delicate features and blonde hair, which she wore in elegant styles that never seemed disheveled even after hours of church activities. She sang in the choir with a voice like crystal, taught the children's Sunday school with patient creativity, and hosted the women's tea fellowship with gracious hospitality. Everyone agreed she was the model of Christian womanhood, destined to make some fortunate man an excellent wife. Thomas recognized all these qualities. He'd observed Catherine for years, had worked alongside her on various church committees, and had even shared several pleasant conversations over coffee after Wednesday evening services. She was kind, articulate, clearly devoted to her faith, and showed every indication of being interested in him romantically. Her smiles lasting a fraction longer than necessary. Her questions about his week filled with genuine curiosity, yet something held him back. He couldn't quite identify what it was. Some instinct that whispered this wasn't the right match, despite how perfect it appeared on paper. The pressure from Pastor Hartley had been growing more direct in recent months. Just last week, during their Thursday meeting, the conversation had taken a decidedly personal turn. "Thomas, I want to speak to you man to man, father to potential son-in-law," Pastor Hartley had said, setting aside the building committee reports they'd been reviewing. "Catherine cares for you deeply. I see it in her eyes when your name is mentioned. She's 26 now, at an age when a woman begins to worry about her future, about whether the desires God has placed in her heart for marriage and family will be fulfilled." The pastor had leaned forward, his expression earnest. "You're the man I've been praying for her to marry, Thomas. Someone with your faith, your character, your commitment to the Lord's work. Together, you two could build something extraordinary, a marriage that serves as a testimony to this community. A partnership in ministry that could impact generations." Thomas had felt the weight of those words pressing down on him like physical force. "Pastor Hartley, I'm honored by your confidence. Catherine is a remarkable woman, truly. I need to be certain. Marriage is a lifetime covenant. I want to be sure I'm following God's leading, not just responding to expectations." Of course, the pastor had agreed, though his tone carried a hint of impatience. "But Thomas, be careful not to use seeking God's will as an excuse for indecision. Sometimes the path is clear, and what we call seeking guidance is actually just fear of commitment. Proverbs tells us that he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. Catherine is right there, ready and willing. What more confirmation do you need?" The conversation had left Thomas unsettled. Was the pastor right? Was he overthinking something that should be simple? Catherine checked every box of what he should want in a wife. The pastor's blessing would smooth every aspect of their marriage. The congregation would celebrate their union as a perfect match. His mother, who still lived in the old family home in town, had been dropping hints about grandchildren with increasing frequency. Yet the hesitation remained, irrational and persistent. That hesitation had crystallized into something sharper 3 weeks ago. The Sunday morning, everything changed. Thomas had arrived at church early, as always, to check that the sanctuary's temperature was properly set and that the sound system was functioning correctly. He was adjusting a microphone on the pulpit when he heard voices coming from the fellowship hall, raised in argument. He recognized Pastor Hartley's voice immediately, its usual warm authority replaced by cold anger. "I've told you before, Rachel, your presence here is disruptive. People are uncomfortable. Your situation, your history, it reflects poorly on this congregation. I haven't done anything wrong." The second voice was quieter, female, carrying a tremor that suggested barely controlled emotion. "I just came to worship. I sit in the back. I don't bother anyone. I leave immediately after the service. What more do you want from me?" "What I want is for you to show some discretion," the pastor replied, his tone sharp. "Find another church, somewhere you're not known. Somewhere your reputation won't be a stumbling block to others. Your husband's actions brought shame on this community. Every time someone sees you, they're reminded of that scandal. It's been 3 years, Rachel. It's time to move on, and that means moving away." Thomas had stood frozen, shocked by the harshness in the pastor's voice. He'd never heard the man speak to anyone with such unveiled contempt. "This was my church, too," Rachel said, her voice breaking slightly. "Before I married David, I grew up in these pews. My parents were married here, are buried in the cemetery behind this building. This is my spiritual home. I have nowhere else to go." "Then perhaps that should tell you something," Pastor Hartley said coldly. "Perhaps God himself is showing you that it's time to start fresh somewhere else." "I'm trying to be pastoral here, Rachel, but you're making it very difficult. The leadership has discussed this. Your continued attendance is causing problems. Members have complained. We need to think about the spiritual health of the majority, not just your personal feelings." There was a long silence. When Rachel spoke again, her voice was steadier, though Thomas could hear the pain beneath the words. "I understand, Pastor. I won't cause you any more trouble. I'll find somewhere else to worship." The sound of footsteps approaching made Thomas move quickly away from the fellowship hall entrance. He busied himself with the sound system, but watched from the corner of his eye as a woman emerged from the hallway. Rachel Brennan was perhaps 30 years old, though grief seemed to have aged her beyond those years. She was thin, almost gaunt, wearing a simple navy dress that had been mended carefully at one seam. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her face, while showing traces of what must have once been considerable beauty, was drawn and pale. She moved with her shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. She didn't see Thomas as she hurried through the sanctuary toward the front door, her hand clutching a worn Bible and her eyes fixed on the floor. But Thomas saw her, really saw her, perhaps for the first time, despite having been in the same building with her dozens of times over the past 3 years. He'd known Rachel's story, of course. Everyone in Millbrook knew it. 3 years ago, her husband David Brennan had been arrested for embezzling nearly $50,000 from Millbrook Savings and Loan, where he'd worked as a loan officer. The scandal had dominated local conversation for months. David had apparently been gambling, accumulating massive debts, and had stolen from customer accounts to cover his losses. The trial had been sensational. Evidence of David's crimes was overwhelming, and he'd been sentenced to 15 years in prison. But the scandal hadn't ended with his incarceration. During the investigation, it came out that David had been having an affair with a woman from a neighboring town, someone he'd met at the casino where he'd been squandering money. The betrayal had been complete, financial and marital, and the humiliation for Rachel had been public and absolute. In the aftermath, Rachel had lost everything. Their home had been seized to pay restitution to David's victims. Her own savings, never substantial, had been consumed by legal fees. She'd been left with nothing but debt, shame, and a tarnished reputation that came from nothing she herself had done. The town's response had been brutal in its judgment. Despite Rachel's obvious innocence of her husband's crimes, many people treated her as if guilt by association made her equally culpable. Women whispered when she passed. Former friends crossed the street to avoid conversation. Job opportunities mysteriously evaporated when potential employers learned her last name. The cruelest blow had been the nickname that emerged in whispered conversations and eventually became bold enough to be spoken in her presence. The cursed widow. The term wasn't technically accurate. David was alive, merely imprisoned, but it captured the community's superstitious sense that Rachel carried some kind of spiritual taint. Her husband's spectacular moral failure was interpreted by many as evidence of some deeper spiritual deficiency, either in him or by extension in her. Thomas had been aware of all this in an abstract way, but he'd never given Rachel much thought. She was simply part of the background of church life, someone who appeared briefly and disappeared quickly, never participating in the social activities that formed the real connective tissue of congregation life. He'd registered her presence the way one registers furniture. Noted but not truly seen, but watching her hurry out of the sanctuary that morning, shoulders hunched under the weight of Pastor Hartley's rejection, Thomas felt something shift inside him. This wasn't an abstract social problem or a general principle about showing Christian charity. This was a specific woman being told she wasn't welcome in the church where she'd worshipped since childhood, being rejected by a pastor who was supposed to shepherd all of his flock, not just the comfortable and respectable members. The sermon that followed haunted Thomas, though probably not in the way Pastor Hartley intended. The text was from Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats, where Christ separates people based on how they treated the least of these. Pastor Hartley preached with his usual eloquence about the importance of charitable works and caring for those in need, but Thomas couldn't stop thinking about Rachel, hurrying out of the building just an hour before, Having been told, essentially, that her need for spiritual community didn't matter because her presence was inconvenient to others. The disconnect between the sermon's message and the pastor's private treatment of a vulnerable woman created a cognitive dissonance Thomas couldn't ignore. Over the following days, Thomas found his thoughts returning repeatedly to that morning. He began noticing things he'd overlooked before. Rachel worked at Morrison's Diner on the edge of town, one of the few employers willing to hire her despite her husband's crimes. She worked double shifts most days, her thin frame moving tirelessly between tables as she served customers who often left insultingly small tips or no tips at all. She lived in a small apartment above Henderson's hardware store, one of the cheapest rentals in town. Thomas had done some repair work on the building last year and knew the apartments were barely habitable, drafty in winter, stifling in summer, with unreliable plumbing and questionable electrical wiring. He observed that Rachel still came to church on Sundays, despite Pastor Hartley's clear desire for her to leave. She arrived exactly as the service began and departed the moment it ended, never lingering for the fellowship time that everyone else enjoyed. She sat alone in the back left corner, the pew around her conspicuously empty as people chose to crowd together elsewhere rather than sit near her. It was wrong, fundamentally, undeniably wrong, and Thomas found he could no longer pretend he didn't see it. The decision to speak to Rachel didn't come from careful deliberation. It emerged spontaneously one Wednesday evening after the midweek service. Thomas had stayed late helping stack chairs in the fellowship hall and was walking to his truck when he saw Rachel emerging from the shadows near the parking lot. She'd obviously been waiting for most people to leave before making her way to her car, an ancient Ford sedan that looked like it might not survive another winter. She moved quickly, keys already in hand, clearly hoping to reach her vehicle without incident. "Mrs. Brennan," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the quiet parking lot. Rachel froze, her body tensing as if preparing for confrontation. She turned slowly, and in the amber glow of the parking lot lights, Thomas could see wariness mixed with resignation in her expression. "Yes," she said quietly, her hand tightening on her keys. Thomas realized he'd acted without planning what to say. He crossed the distance between them, stopping at a respectful distance. "I'm Thomas Caldwell. I don't think we've been properly introduced. I know who you are," Rachel said, her tone neutral. "Everyone knows who you are," I wanted to say, Thomas began, then paused, searching for the right words. "I overheard part of your conversation with Pastor Hartley a few weeks ago, the one about your church attendance. I want you to know, I think what he said was wrong." Rachel's eyes widened slightly, surprise breaking through her guarded expression. "Mr. Caldwell, you don't need to involve yourself in. I think you have every right to worship here," Thomas continued. "This is your church, your spiritual home. No one should be making you feel unwelcome, especially not the pastor." For a long moment, Rachel simply stared at him, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of trick or test. "That's kind of you to say," she finally responded, her voice thick with emotion. "But you don't understand what it's like. What people think of me, the judgments they've made. I understand that you've done nothing wrong," Thomas said firmly. "Your husband's choices aren't yours. His crimes aren't your crimes. The fact that people can't see that distinction says more about them than about you." Rachel's eyes glistened with tears she was clearly fighting to control. "Mr. Caldwell, I appreciate this. I do, but you should be careful. Defending me, being seen, talking to me, it won't be good for your reputation. People will wonder about your judgment. Pastor Hartley doesn't control who I speak to or what I think is right," Thomas interrupted, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "And I don't care what people wonder about my judgment. I care about doing what's right, and what's right is treating you with the dignity and respect you deserve." The tears Rachel had been holding back finally escaped, tracking slowly down her cheeks. She wiped at them hastily, embarrassed by the display of emotion. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk anything for me? You don't even know me. It was the same question Thomas had been asking himself, and he still didn't have a complete answer. But standing there in the parking lot, watching this woman who had endured so much unjust suffering, he felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because I think you've been alone long enough." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications Thomas was only beginning to understand. This wasn't just about defending someone being treated unjustly. It was about connection, about seeing another person's pain and choosing to step toward it rather than away from it. Rachel looked at him for a long moment, her expression a complex mixture of hope, fear, and disbelief. "You don't know what you're offering," she said softly. "You don't know what it means to be associated with me in this town." "Then maybe it's time I learned," Thomas replied. Neither of them realized it in that moment. But that conversation in the church parking lot was the beginning of something that would transform both of their lives and challenge everything Millbrook thought it knew about faith, judgment, and redemption. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning after his conversation with Rachel in the church parking lot, Thomas woke with an unusual sense of purpose. He'd spent a restless night thinking about their exchange, about the vulnerability in her eyes when she'd asked why he would risk anything for her. The question had lodged itself in his mind, demanding a more complete answer than he'd been able to provide in the moment. Over breakfast, he made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He would reach out to Rachel deliberately, publicly, and let the consequences unfold as they would. The years he'd spent being careful, being the model of propriety that everyone expected, suddenly felt like a cage he needed to escape. His opportunity came that Friday afternoon. Thomas had finished a job site inspection early and found himself driving past Morrison's diner just as the lunch rush was ending. Through the large front windows, he could see Rachel moving between tables, clearing dishes and wiping down surfaces with mechanical efficiency. He parked his truck and walked inside, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. The diner was nearly empty now, just a few stragglers lingering over coffee. Rachel was behind the counter, her back to the door as she organized menus. She turned at the sound of the bell, and her expression shifted through several emotions when she saw him. Surprise, confusion, and something that might have been alarm. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Can I get you something?" "Coffee, please," Thomas said, settling onto one of the counter stools. "And please call me Thomas. Mr. Caldwell makes me feel like I should be wearing a suit and discussing mortgage rates." A ghost of a smile flickered across Rachel's face before she suppressed it. She poured coffee with practiced precision, setting the cup in front of him without meeting his eyes. "Cream and sugar are right there," she said, gesturing to the containers on the counter. Thomas added cream, watching as Rachel moved to continue her cleaning tasks. "Business looks slow this afternoon," he observed. "It picks up again around dinner time," Rachel replied, her tone polite but distant. She was treating him like any other customer, maintaining professional boundaries that felt deliberate. "Rachel," Thomas said, and something in his tone made her stop and look at him directly. "I meant what I said the other night, about you not being alone anymore. I'd like us to be friends if you're willing." Rachel's hands stilled on the rag she'd been using to wipe the counter. "Thomas," she said quietly, using his first name for the first time, "you don't understand what you're asking for. Being my friend, being seen with me, it will cost you. This town has already decided who I am, what I represent. They won't look kindly on you associating with the cursed widow." "I'm not particularly concerned with what this town thinks," Thomas said, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. He was concerned, but he was discovering that his concern for Rachel's isolation mattered more. "You should be," Rachel countered, her voice gaining strength. "You have a reputation here, a position. Pastor Hartley trusts you, relies on you. His daughter," she paused, then continued more carefully, "Everyone knows Catherine Hartley is interested in you. If you start spending time with me, people will talk. They'll question your judgment. They'll make assumptions. Let them," Thomas said with more confidence than he felt. "I'm a grown man, capable of choosing my own friends. If people want to make assumptions, that's their problem, not mine." Rachel studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether he truly understood what he was proposing. "Why?" she asked again, the same question from the parking lot. "You barely know me. Why would you willingly take on the social burden that comes with being associated with me?" Thomas set down his coffee cup, considering his answer carefully. 3 weeks ago, I overheard Pastor Hartley telling you to find another church. I saw your face when you left the sanctuary. I watched you hurry out like you were being chased, and I realized I'd been seeing you without really seeing you for 3 years. I've been so focused on being the person everyone expects me to be that I've stopped noticing the people around me who are hurting." He paused, then continued. "My father used to say that faith without action is just philosophy. That believing the right things doesn't matter if you're not willing to do the hard things those beliefs require. I've been coasting on correct theology and church attendance, but I haven't been living like someone who actually takes Christ's teaching seriously. You deserve better than what this town has given you, and I need to be better than what I've been." Rachel's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't try to hide them. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll let me be your friend," Thomas replied. "Say you'll give me a chance to prove that not everyone in Millbrook has forgotten what compassion looks like." The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Finally, Rachel nodded slowly. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay, Thomas. I'll give you a chance. But please understand what you're walking into." "I understand," Thomas said, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't, not fully. "Now tell me about yourself. Real things, not what the gossips say. Where did you grow up? What did you want to be before life took you in other directions?" What followed was the first real conversation Thomas and Rachel had ever had. She spoke haltingly at first, clearly unused to anyone showing genuine interest in her life. But gradually, as Thomas asked questions and listened with authentic attention, her words came more easily. She'd grown up in Millbrook, the only daughter of Harold and June Preston. Her father had been a machinist at the textile mill before it closed. Her mother had taught piano lessons from their small home on Cedar Street. Rachel had been a good student, had dreamed of becoming a teacher herself, had even attended 1 year at the State Teachers College before her father's sudden death from pneumonia forced her to return home and help support her mother. She'd met David Brennan at a church social when she was 22. He'd been charming, attentive, seemingly stable with his job at the bank. They'd married after a brief courtship that now, in retrospect, felt rushed. Her mother had passed away just 6 months after the wedding, leaving Rachel alone with her husband. She was only beginning to realize she didn't truly know. The warning signs were there, Rachel said, her voice distant as she revisited those memories. He was secretive about money. He'd disappear for entire weekends and be vague about where he'd been. He'd become angry over small things, then apologize profusely and promise to do better. But I kept making excuses. I'd been taught that marriage was forever, that a good wife stood by her husband no matter what. So I ignored my instincts. She wrapped her arms around herself, a protective gesture that made Thomas's chest tighten with sympathy. When the police came to arrest him, when all the evidence came out about the embezzling and the affair, I felt like such a fool. Everyone else seemed to know something was wrong with David. But I'd been so committed to making the marriage work that I'd blinded myself to reality. "That doesn't make you a fool," Thomas said firmly. "That makes you loyal, hopeful. Those are virtues, not weaknesses. What happened to David isn't a reflection on you." "Tell that to the people in this town," Rachel said with a bitter edge to her voice. "They look at me and see failure. They see a woman who couldn't keep her husband faithful or honest. They see someone who must have known what he was doing and either participated or was too stupid to notice. Either way, I'm guilty in their eyes," Thomas felt anger rising in his chest, not at Rachel, but at the collective cruelty of a community that had decided to punish someone for crimes she hadn't committed. "Then their eyes are seeing wrong," he said. And maybe it's time someone started pointing that out. Over the following weeks, Thomas made good on his commitment to friendship. He began stopping by the diner regularly, not just for quick coffee, but for actual meals, where he'd sit at the counter and talk with Rachel during her breaks. He invited her to attend the town's summer concert series in Riverside Park, an invitation she initially refused, before he gently insisted that she deserved to enjoy normal activities like anyone else. Their first public outing to the concert was everything Rachel had warned him it would be. The moment they arrived together, Thomas carrying a blanket and picnic basket while Rachel walked beside him, conversations stopped. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Thomas felt Rachel tense beside him, saw her instinct to flee warring with her determination to stay. He touched her elbow gently. "We're just two friends enjoying music on a summer evening," he said quietly. "Don't let them make it anything more than that." They found a spot on the grass, away from the densest clusters of people. As the band played, Thomas maintained a steady stream of light conversation, asking Rachel about her favorite types of music, sharing stories about his father's terrible singing voice and how it never stopped him from belting out hymns in church. Gradually, Rachel relaxed, even laughed at some of his stories, her face transforming when genuine joy briefly broke through her habitual guardedness. But the social consequences Thomas had been warned about arrived swiftly. That Sunday at church, he felt the shift immediately. People who normally greeted him warmly were suddenly distant. Conversations stopped when he approached. During the fellowship time after the service, he found himself standing alone with his coffee while groups formed and reformed around him, excluding him from their circles. Catherine Hartley approached him near the end of fellowship time, her usual warm smile strained. "Thomas, could we talk privately for a moment?" she asked, her voice tight. They stepped into the empty library room off the main fellowship hall. Catherine closed the door and turned to face him, her expression pained. "People are talking," she said without preamble. "About you and Rachel Brennan. About you being seen with her around town." "Let them talk," Thomas said, keeping his voice even. "I'm allowed to have friends." "Rachel Brennan isn't just any friend," Catherine said, frustration creeping into her tone. "She's Thomas. She represents everything wrong that can happen when someone makes poor choices. Being associated with her makes people question your judgment." "My judgment is fine," Thomas replied. "What people should be questioning is why they've decided to punish someone for her husband's crimes." Catherine's face flushed. "It's not punishment. It's natural consequences. She married poorly. She failed to see what her husband truly was. Those failures have results, so she deserves to be isolated, treated like a pariah, made to feel unwelcome in her own church." Thomas heard his voice rising and forced himself to moderate his tone. "Catherine, does that sound like Christian charity to you?" "Christian charity doesn't mean we ignore wisdom," Catherine countered. "Proverbs warns about the company we keep, about how bad associations corrupt good character. Rachel's situation is tragic, yes, but that doesn't mean you need to entangle yourself in it. You have responsibilities, Thomas. People look up to you. My father relies on you. You're meant for leadership in this church, possibly even becoming a deacon like your father. But not if you persist in this friendship with someone whose reputation is so damaged." The calculation in Catherine's words struck Thomas forcefully. This wasn't about concern for his well-being. This was about protecting an image, maintaining a status quo that depended on clear social hierarchies. Good people associated with good people. The fallen stayed fallen. The system worked as long as everyone accepted their assigned place. "I'm sorry you feel that way," Thomas said quietly, "but I won't abandon Rachel to protect my reputation. If people can't understand that, then perhaps I'm not meant for the leadership roles you're describing." Catherine's expression shifted from frustration to something colder. "You're throwing away everything, Thomas. For what? For someone who can't even give you what a real relationship could offer. She's still married. Her husband is in prison, but legally she's not free. This friendship can never become anything more. So what exactly do you think you're doing? The question hung in the air, sharp and challenging. Thomas realized he didn't have a complete answer. His feelings about Rachel were complex, still forming. Was this simply about defending someone being treated unjustly? Or was it becoming something deeper, something that went beyond moral principles into personal connection? "I'm being her friend," Thomas said finally. "That's all I'm thinking about right now. Being someone she can count on in a town full of people who've decided she doesn't matter." "And what about me?" Catherine asked, her voice dropping to something vulnerable beneath the anger. "What about us? Everyone thought, we were moving towards something. My father has been planning, I've been hoping, and now you're just, abandoning all of that for her?" Thomas felt genuine regret at the pain in Catherine's voice. He'd never explicitly encouraged her romantic interest, but neither had he definitively discouraged it. He'd let the situation remain ambiguous because doing so was easier than having this difficult conversation. "Catherine, I'm sorry if I gave you the wrong impression," he said gently. "You're a wonderful woman. You'll make someone very happy, but I don't think I'm that someone. I don't think I ever was, honestly. I've been trying to be the person everyone expects me to be for so long that I stopped listening to what I actually feel, what I actually want." "And you want her?" Catherine asked, disbelief and hurt mixing in her tone. "The cursed widow! You'd choose her over me." "I'm not choosing between you," Thomas said. "I'm choosing to be authentic instead of performing a role. I'm choosing to follow my conscience instead of social expectations. If that means disappointing people, I'm sorry, but I can't keep living my life by committee approval." Catherine stared at him for a long moment, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You'll regret this," she said finally. "When my father hears about this conversation, when the church leadership understands what you're doing, you'll regret choosing her over everything else you could have had." She left the library room, closing the door firmly behind her. Thomas stood alone, his heart pounding, fully aware that he'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The consequences Catherine predicted would arrive soon enough. But as he thought about Rachel's face when she'd laughed at the concert, the first genuine joy he'd seen from her, he couldn't bring himself to regret his choice. That evening, Thomas drove to Rachel's apartment. She answered his knock, looking exhausted from her dinner shift at the diner, still wearing her uniform with its faded name tag. Her expression filled with concern when she saw his face. "What happened?" she asked immediately. "I had a conversation with Catherine Hartley," Thomas said. "She made it clear that continuing our friendship will cost me socially, that the church leadership won't approve, that I'm throwing away my reputation and my future." Rachel's face went pale. "Thomas, if that's true, then you need to step back. I won't be responsible for ruining your life." "I told you this would happen. You're not ruining anything," Thomas said firmly. "I'm making choices, conscious, deliberate choices about what kind of person I want to be and what kind of life I want to live. A life where I only associate with people others approve of isn't a life I want anymore." "But you don't understand what you're giving up," Rachel protested. "Catherine is beautiful, accomplished, everything a man in your position should want. Her father is the most influential man in town. You could have had a perfect life. Perfect according to whose standards?" Thomas asked. "Catherine is all those things you described. But when I'm with her, I feel like I'm playing a part in someone else's script. When I'm with you, I feel like myself. Like I can be honest about my doubts and my questions without being judged. Like my value doesn't depend on performing righteousness for an audience." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Why me?" she whispered, the question that had been hovering between them since their first real conversation. "Why would you risk everything for me? I'm broken, Thomas. I'm carrying baggage that will follow me for the rest of my life. I can't even offer you a future. I'm still legally married to a man in prison. What could you possibly see in me that's worth all this?" Thomas stepped closer, his voice gentle but certain. I see someone who's survived things that would have destroyed most people. I see someone who still shows up to church even though she's made to feel unwelcome, because her faith matters more than her comfort. I see someone kind and thoughtful who asks about my day and actually listens to the answer. I see someone who makes me want to be better than I've been, braver than I've been. He paused, then continued. And yes, I see someone who's been hurt badly and needs a friend who won't abandon her when things get difficult. If that's all this ever is, friendship, then that's enough. But Rachel, I need you to understand, I'm not sacrificing anything. I'm gaining something I didn't even know I was missing. The chance to live authentically. The chance to know someone real instead of someone performing perfection. Rachel was openly crying now, years of isolation and pain breaking through her carefully maintained defenses. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I don't know how to let someone care about me again. I'm so afraid of being hurt, of being abandoned, when you finally realize I'm not worth all this trouble. Then we'll figure it out together, Thomas said. One day at a time. No expectations beyond friendship for now. Just let me be here. Let me show you that not everyone will abandon you. Rachel nodded slowly, unable to speak through her tears. Thomas stayed with her that evening, sitting in her sparse living room, talking about small things and large things until the sun set and the streetlights came on outside. It wasn't romantic, not in any conventional sense. But it was real, honest, and the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. As Thomas drove home late that night, he knew the storm was just beginning. Pastor Hartley would hear about his conversation with Catherine. The church leadership would demand explanations. His reputation would be systematically dismantled by people who saw his friendship with Rachel as evidence of poor judgment or worse. But for the first time in years, Thomas felt truly alive, truly himself. He was finally living according to his own conscience instead of others' expectations. Whatever came next, he would face it knowing he'd chosen authenticity over approval, compassion over conformity. The real test of that choice was coming sooner than he imagined. The phone call came on Tuesday morning while Thomas was reviewing blueprints for a new housing development on the north side of town. His secretary, Mrs. Henderson, a kindly woman in her 60s who had worked for his father before him, knocked softly on his office door. Thomas, Pastor Hartley's online too, she said, her expression troubled. He sounds quite serious. Thomas felt his stomach tighten, but kept his voice steady. Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I'll take it. He waited until she'd closed the door before picking up the receiver. Pastor Hartley, good morning. Thomas. The pastor's voice carried none of its usual warmth. We need to meet today, this afternoon at 2 o'clock in my office. This isn't a request. The line went dead before Thomas could respond. He sat holding the receiver for a moment, absorbing the hostile tone that had replaced years of mentorship and friendship. Whatever was coming, it wouldn't be pleasant. Thomas arrived at the church 5 minutes early, a habit ingrained from years of being punctual to every commitment. The church secretary, Mrs. Dawson, barely looked at him when he entered, her usual chatty demeanor replaced by cold efficiency. Pastor Hartley is expecting you, she said, gesturing toward the office door without meeting his eyes. The pastor's office was exactly as Thomas remembered from countless Thursday afternoon meetings. Dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with theological texts, a large desk positioned to catch afternoon light from the window overlooking the church cemetery. But the atmosphere felt different now, charged with tension that made the familiar space seem foreign. Pastor Hartley sat behind his desk, his posture rigid. He didn't stand when Thomas entered, didn't offer his usual handshake or warm greeting. Sit down, Thomas, he said, his voice flat. Thomas settled into the leather chair across from the desk. The same chair where he'd received counsel about grief after his father's death, where he'd discussed building projects and ministry strategies, where he'd been told he had leadership potential and a bright future in the church. That future was about to be redefined. I'm going to be direct, Pastor Hartley began without preamble. Your behavior over the past month has become a serious concern to the church leadership. Your public association with Rachel Brennan, your defense of her, your rejection of my daughter's interest, all of it demonstrates a troubling departure from sound judgment. Thomas had prepared himself for this conversation, but the bluntness still stung. Pastor, I don't believe befriending someone who's been unjustly ostracized demonstrates poor judgment. If anything, it's the ostracism itself that troubles my conscience. Unjustly ostracized. Pastor Hartley's voice rose slightly. Thomas, the woman's husband is in prison for theft and adultery. The scandal he created nearly destroyed several families in this congregation when their savings were stolen. Rachel's presence reminds people of that trauma every single Sunday. Asking her to worship elsewhere wasn't cruelty, it was pastoral wisdom. It was cruelty dressed up as wisdom, Thomas countered, his own voice gaining strength. Rachel committed none of those crimes. She was David's victim as much as anyone else, more so, actually. She lost her home, her savings, her reputation, her husband. And instead of this church wrapping around her with support, we've treated her like she was guilty by association. Pastor Hartley's face flushed red. We have to think about the spiritual health of the entire congregation, not just one person's feelings. Rachel's situation, however unfortunate, creates problems. Members have expressed discomfort. Donors have questioned whether we're maintaining proper standards. A church's reputation matters, Thomas. It affects our ability to reach people with the gospel. So we sacrifice one vulnerable woman to protect our reputation, Thomas asked, unable to keep the disgust from his voice. That doesn't sound like the gospel to me, Pastor. That sounds like the Pharisees deciding who deserves mercy based on social acceptability. The comparison hit its mark. Pastor Hartley's expression darkened further. Don't you dare lecture me about the gospel, young man. I've been preaching it for 30 years. I've built this church from 50 members to over 500. I know what it takes to maintain a healthy, growing congregation, and it's not coddling people who make poor life choices. Rachel didn't make poor choices, Thomas said firmly. She married someone who turned out to be a criminal. That's not the same as making poor choices. And even if she had made mistakes, since when do we only show compassion to people who've lived perfectly? Pastor Hartley stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This isn't just about Rachel, he said, his voice taking on a different quality, something closer to personal hurt. Catherine came to me in tears after your conversation on Sunday. She'd been hoping, praying, that you would ask for permission to court her. Instead, you rejected her for a woman who can't even legally marry you. Do you have any idea how that feels as her father? To watch my daughter be passed over for someone so clearly inferior? There it was, the real wound beneath the theological arguments. This wasn't primarily about church reputation or pastoral wisdom. This was about a father whose daughter had been rejected, whose plans for a perfect match had been disrupted by Thomas's unexpected choices. Pastor Hartley, Thomas said, choosing his words carefully, I never made any promises to Catherine. I never led her to believe we were moving toward courtship. If she developed expectations, I'm sorry, but I can't marry someone to fulfill other people's plans for my life. And Catherine isn't inferior to anyone, but neither is Rachel. They're just different people, and I'm drawn to Rachel in ways I never was to your daughter. Drawn to her, Pastor Hartley repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. You're drawn to a married woman, Thomas. Do you understand how that looks? How it sounds? People are starting to whisper that your interest in Rachel might be less than pure, that you're waiting for her to divorce David so you can swoop in like some kind of rescuer. It's inappropriate. It's scandalous. And it needs to stop. Thomas felt anger flaring in his chest. My friendship with Rachel is entirely appropriate. We've done nothing wrong. We've been seen together in public places, always behaving with complete propriety. If people are whispering impropriety, that's because they can't imagine a man and woman simply being friends without some ulterior motive. Because there usually is an ulterior motive, Pastor Hartley shot back. Be honest with yourself, Thomas. You're not just being her friend. You're falling for her. Maybe you already have fallen for her. And that's a problem because she's married. Her husband is alive, even if he's imprisoned. Biblically, she's not free. So this friendship you're defending is actually leading both of you toward temptation and sin. The accusation hung in the air, forcing Thomas to confront feelings he'd been trying to keep undefined. Was he falling for Rachel? The question had been circling his thoughts for weeks, but he'd pushed it aside, telling himself he was simply being a good Christian and a true friend. But if he was honest, completely honest, his feelings had begun to shift into territory that went beyond platonic friendship. "I care about her," Thomas admitted slowly. "More than I initially intended to. But we haven't crossed any lines, Pastor. We haven't been inappropriate. And I won't apologize for caring about someone who desperately needed someone to care." "Then you need to step back," Pastor Hartley said, his tone shifting from anger to something that sounded almost like pleading. "Before this goes further, before you compromise yourself beyond repair, you need to end this friendship. Distance yourself from Rachel, let her find her way without your involvement. Show this congregation that you understand proper boundaries and godly wisdom." Thomas met the pastor's eyes directly. "And if I don't?" The silence that followed was heavy with consequence. Pastor Hartley returned to his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of official authority rather than personal relationship. "Then the elders and I will have to seriously reconsider your involvement in church leadership," he said. "Your position leading the men's Bible study will be suspended pending review. Your management of the building committee will be reassigned. Your name will be removed from consideration for the deacon board. And we'll make it clear to the congregation that your behavior doesn't reflect the standards we expect from our leaders." Thomas felt the words like physical blows. Everything he'd built over years of faithful service, every role he'd assumed in the church's life, was being stripped away. The church had been the center of his social world, his spiritual community, his father's legacy. Walking away from it meant losing connections that stretched back to his childhood. "You're asking me to choose between Rachel's well-being and my place in this church," Thomas said quietly. "I'm asking you to choose between wisdom and foolishness," Pastor Hartley corrected. "Between honoring the spiritual authority God has placed over you and following your feelings wherever they lead. Between protecting your testimony and compromising it for someone who can't offer you anything but scandal." Thomas stood slowly, his decision crystallizing even as he spoke. "Then I choose Rachel. I choose defending someone who's been wronged over protecting my reputation. I choose authentic relationship over performing righteousness. And if that means losing my place in church leadership, so be it." Pastor Hartley's face went pale, then flushed again with anger. "You're making a terrible mistake, Thomas. One you'll regret when the reality of your choice becomes clear. Rachel Brennan is a burden, a liability. She'll drag you down with her, and when you finally see that, it will be too late to undo the damage." "Maybe," Thomas acknowledged. "Or maybe I'll discover that the life I've been living was the real burden, and Rachel is actually showing me what freedom looks like. Either way, it's my choice to make, my risk to take." He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "For what it's worth, Pastor, I'm grateful for everything you've done for me over the years. Your mentorship after my father died meant more than I can express. But I think you've confused church success with spiritual faithfulness. I think you've built something impressive while forgetting what it was supposed to be for. And I can't keep participating in a system that measures people's worth by their social acceptability rather than their inherent dignity as God's image bearers." "Get out," Pastor Hartley said, his voice shaking. "Get out of my office and don't come back until you're ready to repent of this arrogance and submit to proper spiritual authority." Thomas left without another word. Walking through the church building that had been his second home for 3 decades, Mrs. Dawson watched him pass with an expression of pity mixed with disapproval. The building itself seemed different now, as if his change in status had altered the very atmosphere of the place. He sat in his truck in the church parking lot for several minutes, processing what had just happened. In the span of one conversation, He'd lost his church community, his leadership roles, and the respect of a man he'd admired for years. The price of choosing Rachel over conformity was higher than he'd fully anticipated, but as he started the engine and drove toward Morrison's diner, where Rachel would be working the afternoon shift, Thomas felt something unexpected: relief. The performance was over. The careful maintenance of image and reputation no longer controlled his choices. He was free to be fully himself, even if that self disappointed people who had expected something different. Rachel was refilling salt shakers when he walked into the diner. She looked up, and whatever she saw in his face made her set down the shaker and come around the counter immediately. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "I had my meeting with Pastor Hartley," Thomas said. "It went about as badly as expected. Worse, actually. I've been removed from all leadership positions and basically told not to come back until I end our friendship and apologize for my poor judgment." Rachel's face crumpled. "Thomas, no. This is exactly what I was afraid of. You've lost everything because of me." "Not everything," Thomas corrected gently. "I've lost a role I was playing, a position I was maintaining, but I've gained something more valuable. The freedom to live according to my actual convictions instead of other people's expectations." "That's not nothing, Rachel. That's everything. But the church, your father's church, how can you just walk away from that?" "I'm not walking away from faith," Thomas said. "I'm walking away from a version of faith that measures worth by social standing and treats wounded people like liabilities. There's a difference." Rachel shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I should end this. I should tell you to go back, to make peace with them, to choose the life you were supposed to have. You deserve better than this mess I've brought into your life." Thomas reached across the counter and gently took her hand, the first time he'd deliberately touched her beyond polite handshakes. "Rachel, look at me. You haven't brought mess into my life. You've brought clarity. You've helped me see what really matters and what's just performance. I don't want the life I was supposed to have. I want a life that's authentic, even if it's difficult. And right now, that means standing beside you, regardless of what it costs." "Why?" she whispered, the question that kept recurring between them. "Why would you give up so much for me?" Thomas didn't have a simple answer because the truth was complex and still forming. His feelings for Rachel had evolved beyond simple friendship into something deeper, something he couldn't yet name completely. But beyond romantic attraction, beyond the impulse to rescue someone in distress, there was something else: recognition. In Rachel's isolation and struggle to maintain dignity despite circumstances beyond her control, Thomas saw a mirror of his own hidden self, the part of him that had been performing for others while lone along for permission to be real. "Because you make me want to be brave," he said finally. "Because knowing you has shown me that I've been living half a life, doing and saying the right things, while my actual heart was somewhere else entirely. Because when I'm with you, I don't have to pretend anything. I can just be myself, doubts and questions and all. That's worth more than any church position or social approval." Rachel squeezed his hand, holding on like he was the only solid thing in a shifting world. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted. "I don't know how we navigate this, what it means, where it can possibly go. But Thomas, I need you to understand something. I'm terrified. Terrified of depending on someone again. Terrified of being hurt. Terrified that one day you'll wake up and realize I'm not worth all this sacrifice." "Then we'll be terrified together," Thomas said. "And we'll figure out the next steps as we go. No pressure for this to be anything more than it is right now. Just let's keep being honest with each other. Let's keep choosing authenticity over performance, even when it's hard." They stood there in the empty diner, hands joined across the counter, two people who had been pushed to the margins of their community, finding unexpected solidarity in their shared displacement. Outside, Millbrook continued its routines, unaware that something significant had shifted. Thomas Caldwell had made his choice, and there would be no going back. What neither of them knew yet was that their personal drama was about to collide with forces beyond their small town. circumstances that would test their newfound resolve in ways they couldn't anticipate. The pastor's ultimatum was just the beginning. The real battle for their right to choose their own path was still ahead, and it would require more courage than either of them had yet discovered they possessed. But for now, in the quiet of Morrison's diner on a Tuesday afternoon, they held on to each other and to the fragile hope that choosing truth over comfort might actually lead somewhere worth going. The news of Thomas's falling out with Pastor Hartley spread through Millbrook with the speed of wildfire in dry grass. By Wednesday morning, less than 24 hours after his meeting in the pastor's office, Thomas began experiencing the full weight of social exile that Rachel had warned him about. It started subtly. When he stopped at Brennan's hardware store, no relation to Rachel's imprisoned husband, to pick up supplies for a job site, the owner, Carl Brennan, was cordial but distant. Their usual easy banter about fishing and baseball was replaced by brisk transactional exchanges. Carl rang up the purchases without meeting Thomas's eyes, and when Thomas tried to initiate conversation, the responses were monosyllabic. At the bank, where Thomas had maintained business accounts for 8 years, the branch manager, Douglas Pemberton, called him into his office with an apologetic expression that didn't quite mask the satisfaction beneath it. "Thomas, I'm afraid we need to discuss your loan for the Patterson Street development project," Pemberton said, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. "Some concerns have been raised about the project's viability, and the board feels we need to reassess our exposure." Thomas knew immediately what was happening. The Patterson Street project was solid, the numbers vetted and approved months ago. This wasn't about financial risk. "What concerns specifically?" he asked, keeping his voice level. Pemberton wouldn't meet his eyes. "Just general concerns about market conditions, timing, that sort of thing. We're asking you to provide additional collateral or consider reducing the loan amount significantly." "I'm sure you understand it's just business." "It's not business," Thomas said quietly. "It's punishment. Someone on your board doesn't approve of my personal choices and is using financial pressure to try to force me back in line." Pemberton's face flushed, but he didn't deny it. "Thomas, I'm just doing my job. The board makes decisions. I implement them. If you can provide the additional collateral by Friday, we can proceed as originally planned. If not, we'll need to renegotiate terms." Thomas left the bank understanding that his professional life was about to become considerably more difficult. The Patterson Street project represented 6 months of work and a significant portion of his annual income. Losing it or having to accept worse terms would hurt financially, but more importantly, it would signal to other potential clients that Thomas Caldwell was no longer a safe bet. By Thursday, the pattern was unmistakable. Mrs. Henderson, his loyal secretary, arrived at the office with red-rimmed eyes and a letter of resignation. "Thomas, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "My husband says I can't keep working for you. He says people are talking, saying you've lost your way, and that being associated with your business will hurt his insurance agency. I need this job, you know I do, but Frank is insisting." Thomas felt anger at Frank Henderson's cowardice, but directed none of it toward Mrs. Henderson, who was simply another casualty of the town's collective judgment. "I understand," he said gently. "You need to do what's best for your family. I'll make sure you get 2 weeks' severance pay, and I'll write you the best reference letter I can. You're not angry?" Mrs. Henderson asked, surprised. "I'm angry at the situation," Thomas clarified. "I'm angry that people are so afraid of social disapproval that they'll abandon their principles. But I'm not angry at you. You're caught in the middle of something that isn't your fault." After she left, Thomas sat alone in his office, confronting the reality of his situation. In 3 days, he'd lost his church community, gained restrictions on his business financing, and lost his secretary. The social and professional infrastructure that had supported his life was being systematically dismantled. The phone rang, interrupting his dark thoughts. It was his mother, Eleanor Caldwell, calling from the family home where she'd lived alone since his father's death. "Thomas, we need to talk," she said, her voice carrying a tone he recognized from childhood, the one that meant serious maternal disapproval. "I'm hearing disturbing things about you and some woman. Please tell me these stories aren't true." Thomas closed his eyes, bracing himself. "If you're hearing that I've become friends with Rachel Brennan and that Pastor Hartley disapproves, then yes, those stories are true." The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably. When his mother spoke again, her voice was tight with distress. "Thomas Robert Caldwell, have you lost your mind? Rachel Brennan, the woman whose husband stole from half the town. You're associating with her publicly, defending her?" "I'm being her friend," Thomas said wearily. "She's been treated unjustly, and I'm not willing to participate in that injustice anymore." "Unjustly?" His mother's voice rose. "Her husband is a criminal and an adulterer. Her judgment in marrying him speaks volumes. And now you're risking everything your father built, everything you've worked for, to defend her. What would your father say, Thomas? What would Robert think of you throwing away his legacy for this woman?" The invocation of his father's memory stung more than Thomas wanted to admit. Robert Caldwell had been a man of rigid principles, deeply committed to the church and to maintaining respectability. But Thomas had also known his father as someone capable of compassion, someone who had quietly helped struggling families without seeking recognition. "I think Dad would understand that doing the right thing sometimes costs something," Thomas said. "He taught me that faith means acting on your convictions, even when it's inconvenient." "That's what I'm doing, Mom. I'm acting on my convictions." "Your convictions are going to leave you alone and ruined," his mother shot back. "Pastor Hartley called me yesterday. He's very concerned about you, Thomas. He thinks you're having some kind of crisis, that you need help. He suggested you might benefit from some time away, maybe a retreat or counseling, to help you regain your perspective." "My perspective is fine," Thomas said firmly. "Better than it's been in years, actually. I know this is hard for you to understand, but I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing." "How can I trust that when everyone who cares about you is saying you've made a terrible mistake?" his mother asked, her voice breaking. "When Pastor Hartley, who's been like a father to you since Robert died, is saying you've lost your way? When the whole town is talking about how you've thrown your life away for a woman who can't even legally marry you?" There it was again, the fundamental question that kept surfacing. What exactly was Thomas doing, and where could it possibly lead? Rachel was still legally married to David, who had 13 years remaining on his prison sentence. Tennessee law made divorce difficult under these circumstances, requiring proof of extensive grounds beyond simple abandonment or adultery. Rachel had been reluctant to even discuss divorce, burdened by religious teachings about the permanence of marriage vows. "I don't know where this leads," Thomas admitted to his mother. "I just know that walking away from Rachel to make other people comfortable would mean betraying something essential in myself. I can't do that, Mom. Not even for you." His mother was crying now, soft sounds of distress that made Thomas's chest ache. "I don't want to lose you too," she whispered. "First your father, and now you're choosing a path that's taking you away from everything we built as a family. I don't know how to accept this, Thomas. I don't know how to watch you destroy yourself. You're not losing me," Thomas said gently. "I'm still your son. I'm still the person Dad raised me to be. I'm just living it out differently than you expected. Can you try to trust me? Can you give me the benefit of the doubt?" "I don't know," his mother said honestly. "I need time to think, to pray about this. But Thomas, please understand, I can't publicly support your choices. I still have to live in this town, attend that church. If I'm seen as approving of your relationship with Rachel, I'll face the same isolation you're experiencing. I'm not strong enough for that." The conversation ended with an uncomfortable goodbye, leaving Thomas feeling more alone than he'd felt since his father's death. His mother's conditional support, her inability to stand with him against community pressure, clarified something important. When real testing came, most people would choose comfort over conviction, safety over solidarity. That evening, Thomas drove to Rachel's apartment, needing to see her. to ground himself in the one relationship that felt authentic amid all the performance and pretense surrounding him. He found her sitting on the small balcony outside her apartment, still in her diner uniform, staring at nothing. "Rough day?" he asked, settling into the rickety chair beside her. Rachel laughed bitterly. "You could say that." "I got fired." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "What? Why?" "Mr. Morrison called me into his office this afternoon," Rachel said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Told me that he's received complaints from customers about my presence making them uncomfortable. Said several regulars have threatened to take their business elsewhere if he keeps me employed. He gave me 2 weeks severance and an apology that meant nothing. I'm done there. That's illegal," Thomas said, anger flaring. "You can't fire someone because of their spouse's criminal record. That's discrimination." "It's Millbrook," Rachel corrected. "It's a small town where everyone knows everyone, and reputation matters more than law. Who am I going to complain to? What lawyer in this town would take my case when doing so would make them just as unpopular as I am?" She turned to look at him, her eyes red from crying. "Thomas, this is what I warned you about. This is what happens when you associate with me. The town doesn't just disapprove, it actively punishes. And now you're experiencing the same thing I've been dealing with for 3 years. Thomas reached over and took her hand. "Tell me everything. What happened to you after David was arrested? I know the broad strokes, but I want to understand what you actually went through." Rachel was quiet for a long moment, gathering her thoughts or perhaps her courage to revisit painful memories. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The day the police came to arrest David, I thought there had been some terrible mistake. David had left for work that morning like always. I was planning to repaint the kitchen, had even bought the paint the week before. Then 2 police officers knocked on the door and asked if I was Mrs. David Brennan. When I said yes, they asked to come inside and sit down." She paused, her grip on Thomas's hand tightening. "They told me David had been arrested at work for embezzlement, that he'd stolen nearly $50,000 over the course of 18 months, that there was evidence of gambling debts, of an affair. They asked me what I knew about his activities. I kept saying there must be a mistake, that David would never do those things. But they showed me bank statements, photographs, evidence I couldn't deny. Within hours, it was all over town. People I'd known my entire life crossed the street to avoid me. Women I'd been friends with stopped returning my calls. The bank seized our house immediately, since David had used it as collateral for loans he'd taken to cover his gambling debts. I had nowhere to go. My mother had died 6 months earlier. I had no other family in town. I ended up sleeping in my car for 2 weeks until I found this apartment." Thomas felt sick, imagining Rachel alone, abandoned, sleeping in her car while dealing with the shock and betrayal of her husband's crimes. "Why didn't the church help?" "Surely someone offered you assistance." Rachel's laugh was harsh. "The church? Thomas, the church was the first place to turn its back on me. Pastor Hartley called me into his office, just like he did with you. He told me that my situation was unfortunate, but that I needed to understand how it looked. David had been a church member, had served on committees, had presented himself as a faithful Christian while committing adultery and theft. The scandal reflected badly on the church's discernment, on their ability to judge character. He strongly suggested, that I find another church community. Said my presence was a reminder of their collective failure of oversight. When I kept attending anyway, because I had literally nowhere else to go, people made it clear I wasn't welcome. They'd leave entire pews empty rather than sit near me. Nobody spoke to me. Nobody invited me to fellowship events. I became invisible, except when I was being used as a cautionary tale about the consequences of poor choices." "What poor choices?" Thomas asked, outraged. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I married David," Rachel said simply. "In this town's eyes, that was my sin. I failed to see what he really was. I failed to be the kind of wife who could keep her husband faithful and honest. I failed, therefore I deserved what happened to me. It's twisted logic, but it's how people justify cruelty. If they can blame the victim, they don't have to feel guilty about abandoning them. Thomas pulled her close, feeling her body shake with suppressed sobs. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I'm sorry you went through that alone. I'm sorry I didn't see it, didn't step in sooner. I was so focused on being the perfect church member that I was blind to the suffering happening right in front of me." "You see it now," Rachel said, pulling back to look at him. "That's what matters. But Thomas, you need to understand what you're signing up for. This isn't going to get better. The town has decided I'm cursed, that anyone who associates with me will share my fate. They're proving that right now by systematically dismantling your life. Your business, your church, your family, everything you've built is under attack because you chose to be my friend. Then we'll build something new," Thomas said with more confidence than he felt. "Something that doesn't depend on the approval of people who've forgotten what compassion looks like." "How?" Rachel asked, her voice desperate. "How do we build anything when we're both being pushed out? I just lost my job. You're losing clients and financing. Your own mother won't support you. What kind of future can we possibly have in a town that's determined to punish us?" Thomas didn't have a good answer. The practical challenges were mounting faster than he could address them. But as he sat there with Rachel, watching the sun set over Millbrook, he felt a stubborn determination settling in his chest. The town could take his reputation, his church position, his business connections. But it couldn't take his ability to choose his own path, to define his own values, to decide who deserved his loyalty. "I don't know how yet," he admitted. "But we'll figure it out, together, one problem at a time. Starting with finding you a new job and finding me a way to keep my business afloat despite the bank's pressure." Rachel leaned her head on his shoulder, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "Why are you like this?" she asked softly. "Why do you keep choosing the hard path when easier options are right in front of you?" "Because the easy path was killing me slowly," Thomas said. "I was so busy being who everyone expected me to be that I forgot who I actually was. You gave me permission to remember. That's worth fighting for, Rachel. You're worth fighting for." They sat together as darkness fell over the town, two people cast out from their community, finding unexpected strength in their shared exile. Neither knew what the next day would bring, what new challenges or losses awaited them. But for now, in this moment, they had each other. And that would have to be enough to face whatever came next. The battle for their right to choose their own path was far from over. In fact, it was about to escalate in ways neither of them anticipated. Forces were moving behind the scenes, conversations were happening in church offices and town council meetings. Plans were being made to either bring Thomas back in line or remove his influence entirely. The small act of choosing friendship over conformity had set in motion consequences that would test whether love and authenticity could survive in a community built on judgment and appearances. The answer to that test was still being written, one difficult choice at a time. The Sunday following Rachel's firing from the diner, Thomas made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. He didn't go to church. For the first time since childhood illness had kept him bedridden at age 7, Thomas Caldwell was absent from Millbrook Community Church on a Sunday morning. Instead, he drove to Rachel's apartment at 9 o'clock. Carrying 2 cups of coffee from the gas station on Highway 64 and a bag of donuts from the bakery in the next town over, Rachel answered the door in her bathrobe, her hair unbrushed, clearly having just woken up. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Thomas, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be at church?" "I decided to worship differently today," Thomas said, offering her one of the coffee cups. "I thought maybe we could spend the morning together. Go for a drive, find somewhere quiet to think and talk. Unless you'd rather go to a different church. They could take you to the Baptist congregation over in Fairview or—" "No," Rachel interrupted quickly. "No more churches. Not today. I can't face another building full of people judging me." A drive sounds perfect. They ended up at Riverside Park, the same place where they'd attended the summer concert that now felt like months ago rather than weeks. The park was nearly empty this early on a Sunday morning, just a few joggers and dog walkers taking advantage of the crisp autumn air. They found a bench overlooking the river and sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, sipping their coffee and watching the water flow past. "I keep waiting for you to change your mind," Rachel said finally, breaking the silence. "To wake up one morning and realize this isn't worth it, that I'm not worth it. Every day you stay, I'm surprised all over again." Thomas turned to look at her, taking in her profile against the morning light. "What would it take for you to believe that I'm not going anywhere? That my choice to stand with you isn't conditional on circumstances improving or the town's approval returning?" Rachel was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know if I can believe that. Everyone else has left, Thomas. Everyone. My friends after David's arrest, my church community, employers who were willing to hire me until they faced social pressure. Even my own sister stopped returning my calls after the scandal broke. She lives in Georgia now, has her own family, her own reputation to protect. She sent me a letter saying she couldn't afford to be associated with my situation, that her husband's business depended on maintaining a respectable image." The pain in her voice was raw, years of accumulated abandonment compressed into a few sentences. Thomas felt anger at all the people who had failed Rachel, but he also understood something she couldn't yet see. Her experience of universal betrayal made his steadfastness almost impossible for her to accept. "Everyone else left," Thomas said carefully, "which means you learned that relationships are conditional, that people's loyalty depends on your circumstances staying comfortable for them. But Rachel, not everyone is like that. Some people mean what they say. Some commitments hold even when they become costly. How do you know you're that kind of person?" Rachel challenged. "How do you know you won't wake up 6 months from now, after you've lost your business and you're standing in town, and resent me for what my friendship cost you?" It was a fair question, one Thomas had been asking himself during sleepless nights. The honest answer was that he didn't know with absolute certainty. He was making promises about the future based on present convictions, but circumstances had a way of testing whether those convictions were genuine or merely theoretical. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "I can't prove the future to you. All I can do is show up today and tomorrow and the day after that. Eventually, maybe you'll start to believe that I'm not going anywhere. Or maybe you won't, and I'll just have to accept that your past experiences make it impossible for you to fully trust anyone. Either way, I'm choosing to stay." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "That's not fair," she whispered. "You can't just say things like that and expect me not to." She stopped abruptly, clearly having been about to reveal more than she intended. "Not to what?" Thomas prompted gently. Rachel shook her head, wiping at her tears. "Not to start hoping. Not to start imagining a future that can't exist. Thomas, I'm still married. Legally, spiritually, by the beliefs I was raised with, I'm married to David. Even if I wanted to divorce him, which terrifies me for reasons I can't fully explain, it would take years. And even then, you'd be marrying a divorced woman, which would bring its own scandal. There's no version of this story where we end up together in the way you deserve." Thomas reached over and took her hand, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I'm not worried about what I deserve. I'm worried about what's right. And what's right is being here with you, supporting you, caring about you, regardless of where it leads or doesn't lead. Can we just focus on that? On today, and being honest with each other, and building something real even if it doesn't fit anyone else's expectations of what it should be?" Before Rachel could respond, a voice called out across the park. "Thomas Caldwell, is that you?" They both turned to see a woman approaching, someone Thomas vaguely recognized but couldn't immediately place. She was perhaps in her late 50s, with grey, streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail and wearing clothes that suggested she'd been out for a morning walk. As she got closer, recognition clicked. This was Margaret Foster, a woman who'd attended Millbrook Community Church years ago before leaving under circumstances Thomas had never fully understood. She'd been involved in some kind of dispute with church leadership, and then she and her husband had simply stopped attending. Thomas had been younger then, less involved in church politics, and hadn't paid much attention to the details. Mrs. Foster, Thomas said, standing politely. "It's good to see you. This is my friend Rachel Brennan." Margaret's sharp eyes moved from Thomas to Rachel and back again, assessing the situation with what seemed like amused understanding. "Rachel Brennan," she repeated thoughtfully. "The so-called cursed widow. And Thomas Caldwell, Pastor Hartley's golden boy, sitting together in the park on a Sunday morning when you should both be in church. My, how interesting." Thomas felt Rachel tense beside him, preparing for judgment or confrontation. But Margaret's expression wasn't hostile. If anything, she looked pleased. "May I join you?" Margaret asked, not waiting for an answer before settling onto the bench beside Rachel. "I promise I'm not here to lecture or condemn. Quite the opposite, actually. I've been hearing things about you two, and I wanted to offer something I wish someone had offered me and my husband 15 years ago. Solidarity." "Solidarity," Thomas repeated, confused. Margaret nodded. "My husband Arthur and I were active members of Millbrook Community Church for 20 years. Arthur was on the elder board. I led the women's ministry. We were respected, trusted, integral to the church's life. Then our daughter, Emily, came home from college and told us she was pregnant. The father was her boyfriend, a young man from a different faith background whom the church leadership had already expressed concerns about." She paused, her expression distant as she revisited painful memories. "We supported Emily. We welcomed her boyfriend into our home, helped them prepare for the baby, walked with them through their decision to marry before the child was born. But Pastor Hartley, who wasn't a senior then but was already influential, decided our response was too permissive. He believed we should have shown more discipline, been more concerned about the moral example being set." "What happened?" Rachel asked quietly. "We were asked to step down from all leadership positions," Margaret said. "Pastor Hartley preached a sermon about the importance of maintaining standards, of not letting compassion override conviction. It was never explicitly about us, but everyone knew. Our friends at church began distancing themselves. People who'd been to our home dozens of times suddenly stopped calling. Within 6 months, we left and started attending a small Methodist church in the next county. Emily and her husband, who's been a wonderful father and provider, by the way, moved to Nashville to escape the judgment." Margaret looked at Thomas with knowing sympathy. "I see the same pattern playing out with you two that happened with us. Someone makes a choice that prioritizes compassion over conformity, and the community responds by isolating them, by making the cost so high that most people eventually capitulate and apologize. It's a system that maintains itself through fear and social pressure." "Why are you telling us this?" Thomas asked. "Because you need to know you're not crazy," Margaret said firmly. "You need to know that choosing to support someone the community has rejected doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're brave. And you need to know that there are others who've walked this path, who understand the cost, and who will stand with you even if it's uncomfortable." She pulled a piece of paper from her jacket pocket and handed it to Thomas. "This is my phone number and address. Arthur and I would like to invite you both to dinner next Friday evening. No agenda, no pressure. Just a meal with people who understand what you're going through and want you to know you're not alone." Thomas stared at the paper, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. "Mrs. Foster, we appreciate this, but having us to dinner could bring the same social consequences on you that we're experiencing." Margaret laughed, a warm sound full of genuine amusement. "Thomas, we've already been through that fire. We lost those friendships 15 years ago, and you know what? We survived. We built a new life with different friends, people whose loyalty didn't depend on our conformity to unwritten social rules. You'll survive too, but it's easier when you don't have to do it completely alone." She stood to leave, then paused and looked directly at Rachel. "My dear, I don't know your full story, but I know enough to recognize injustice when I see it. Whatever burden you're carrying, whatever shame this town has tried to assign to you, please hear me when I say you don't have to accept their judgment. You're allowed to believe better things about yourself than they believe about you." After Margaret walked away, Thomas and Rachel sat in stunned silence. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice thick with emotion. Did that really just happen? Did someone actually offer us friendship without conditions or judgment? Apparently so, Thomas said, still processing the encounter himself. Maybe we're not as alone as we thought. The dinner at the Fosters' home the following Friday opened Thomas's eyes to a reality he'd been blind to for years. The modest house on Maple Street was filled with warmth and laughter, so different from the careful propriety that characterized gatherings in his church circles. Arthur Foster was a retired high school teacher, still sharp and engaged with the world despite his 70 years. Over pot roast and homemade bread, the Fosters told their full story, filling in details Margaret had omitted in the park. The isolation they'd experienced after leaving Millbrook Community Church had been brutal initially. Friends of decades stopped speaking to them. Arthur had been passed over for a position on the school board that he'd been assured was his. Margaret's close friend group, women she'd prayed with and supported through various life crises, had ghosted her completely. The first year was the hardest, Arthur said, refilling their wine glasses. We questioned ourselves constantly, wondered if we'd been too permissive with Emily, too willing to prioritize her well-being over the church's standards. We felt guilty for the division our choices created. What changed? Thomas asked. We met other people, Margaret said. People who'd been hurt by similar religious systems. People who valued authenticity over appearances. We found a church community that measured faith by how you treated the vulnerable, not by how well you maintained respectability. And we realized that the life we'd lost wasn't actually worth keeping. It was built on performance and conditional approval. What we found afterward was built on genuine connection. As the evening progressed, the Fosters introduced Thomas and Rachel to others in their circle. A couple named Jim and Susan Martinez, who'd been ostracized from their previous church for advocating for their gay son. A widow named Dorothy Chen, who'd been pressured to leave her church after questioning financial irregularities in the leadership's handling of mission funds. A young man named Marcus Webb, who'd walked away from his family's church after witnessing how they treated his sister when she got pregnant at 17. Each had a story of choosing integrity over acceptance, of paying a high price for refusing to participate in systems that damaged vulnerable people. And each had found a way not just to survive their exile, but to build richer, more authentic lives afterward. We call ourselves the Island of Misfit Toys, Susan Martinez said with a grin. People who didn't fit the mold, who asked inconvenient questions or made choices that prioritized people over propriety. We've built our own community, our own support network. It's smaller than what we left behind, but it's real. Rachel was quiet through much of the evening, observing these people who'd transformed rejection into resilience. As they were preparing to leave, she pulled Margaret aside. "How did you stop feeling ashamed?" she asked quietly. "How did you get to a place where you could talk about what happened without feeling like you'd failed somehow?" Margaret took both of Rachel's hands in hers. "Shame only has power when you accept other people's right to define your worth. When you recognize that their judgment says more about them than about you, the shame starts to lose its grip. It's not a switch that flips overnight. It's a gradual process of rejecting lies and accepting truth about who you actually are." She squeezed Rachel's hands gently. "You're not cursed, my dear. You're not tainted or deficient or deserving of punishment. You're someone who survived betrayal and loss with dignity. You're someone who kept showing up to church despite being made to feel unwelcome, because your faith mattered more than your comfort. Those are strengths, not weaknesses. Start believing that, and the shame will eventually follow your belief." On the drive home, Rachel was unusually quiet. Thomas let the silence stretch, sensing she was processing the evening's revelations. Finally, as they pulled up to her apartment building, she spoke. "I've spent 3 years believing I deserved what happened to me. That David's crimes and the town's rejection was somehow my fault. Some judgment on my failure to be a better wife or a more discerning person. Tonight was the first time I've heard anyone suggest that maybe the problem wasn't me. Maybe the problem was a system that needs someone to blame, someone to punish. to maintain its sense of order and righteousness. She turned to look at Thomas, her eyes bright in the dim light from the street lamp. Thank you for taking me tonight, for introducing me to people who understand, for showing me that there's life after exile, that being pushed out doesn't mean staying out forever. Thomas reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her face, a gesture of tenderness that felt natural despite the newness of their relationship. You deserve to see that you're not alone in this, that other people have walked this path and found their way through. Rachel caught his hand before he could pull it away, holding it against her cheek. Thomas, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without trying to fix it or talk me out of how I feel. Okay, Thomas said, his heart rate quickening at the seriousness in her voice. I'm falling in love with you, Rachel said, the words tumbling out rushed and afraid. I've been fighting it, telling myself it's just gratitude or loneliness or desperation for human connection. But tonight, watching you with those people, seeing how you listened and cared and opened yourself to their stories, I realized it's more than that. I'm in love with you, and it terrifies me because there's no good way forward. I can't offer you a future. I can't even offer you a present that isn't complicated by my marriage and my situation. But I needed you to know the truth. Thomas felt his breath catch. He'd been aware of his own growing feelings, the way his heart lifted when he saw Rachel, the way her pain felt like his pain. But hearing her name what was between them made it real in a way that was both thrilling and sobering. I'm falling in love with you too, he said quietly. I've been afraid to say it, afraid it would add pressure or expectations to a situation that's already complicated enough. But Rachel, I need you to understand something. I don't need you to have all the answers about the future. I don't need you to be uncomplicated or easy. I just need you to be honest with me, to let me walk beside you through whatever comes next. Can we do that? Can we just be honest about what we feel and figure out the logistics as we go? Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. I don't know how to let myself love someone again after everything that happened with David. I don't know how to trust that you won't eventually realize I'm too broken, too burdened with baggage. Then we'll figure it out together, Thomas said, pulling her into an embrace. We'll take it one day at a time. No pressure to have everything resolved immediately. Just honesty and showing up and choosing each other even when it's difficult. They sat in the car for a long time, holding each other, letting the truth of their feelings settle into the space between them. The future was still uncertain, still fraught with obstacles that had no clear solutions. But in that moment, they had each other and the beginning of a community that understood their struggle. And maybe, Thomas thought, that was enough to build on. Maybe love and authenticity, supported by people who'd survived their own exiles, could create something stronger than the approval they'd lost. Maybe being cast out from systems built on performance and judgment was actually liberation in disguise. Maybe the hardest path was actually leading somewhere worth going. Time would tell. But for now, in the quiet of Thomas's car outside Rachel's apartment, they allowed themselves to hope that their story wasn't ending in tragedy, but just beginning in truth. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail to Thomas's office. He signed for it with a sense of foreboding, recognizing the return address, Pemberton and Associates, the most prominent law firm in Millbrook. His hands were steady as he opened the envelope. But his stomach churned as he read the contents. It was a formal notice that the Millbrook Savings and Loan was calling in his loan for the Patterson Street Development Project, citing a clause about material changes in the borrower's creditworthiness and community standing. They were giving him 30 days to repay the full amount, nearly $75,000, or face foreclosure proceedings on the properties he'd already purchased for the development. Thomas read the letter 3 times, his legal knowledge, limited as it was, telling him this was unusual if not outright improper. Loans weren't typically called due to social disapproval. There had to be legitimate financial concerns cited, and the letter's vague language about community standing seemed legally questionable. He picked up the phone and called the one lawyer he knew personally, Howard Mitchell, who attended Millbrook Community Church and had handled the legal work when Thomas incorporated his business. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable. "Thomas, I can't help you with this," Howard said after listening to the situation. "There's a conflict of interest. Douglas Pemberton is my wife's cousin, and besides that, I have to maintain my relationship with the bank for my other clients. I'm sure you understand. I understand that everyone's principles disappear when it becomes inconvenient to maintain them," Thomas said, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. "That's not fair," Howard protested weakly. "This is business, Thomas. You can't expect people to risk their livelihoods to support your personal choices." After hanging up, Thomas sat at his desk trying to formulate a plan. 30 days to come up with $75,000 was impossible. He had assets, but nothing liquid enough to meet that deadline. The properties for the Patterson Street project were his primary collateral. Losing them would devastate his business and his financial future. He was still staring at the letter when his phone rang. It was Arthur Foster. "Thomas, Margaret and I heard through the grapevine about your situation with the bank," Arthur said without preamble. "I have someone I'd like you to meet. Her name is Patricia Donovan, and she's a lawyer who specializes in civil rights cases and discriminatory lending practices. She's based in Nashville, but takes cases across the state when they involve religious or social discrimination." "Mr. Foster, I appreciate the thought, but I can't afford a Nashville lawyer," Thomas said. "My finances are already stretched thin. Patricia doesn't work that way," Arthur replied. "She takes cases she believes in, often on contingency or for reduced fees. Just meet with her, Thomas. Hear what she has to say." "I'll set it up for Thursday afternoon if you're available," Thomas agreed, mainly because he had no other options. 2 days later, he found himself sitting in a conference room at Patricia Donovan's Nashville office, a modern space that felt worlds away from Millbrook's small-town atmosphere. Patricia Donovan was in her early 40s, with sharp eyes behind designer glasses and a presence that commanded attention. She listened intently as Thomas explained his situation, occasionally making notes, but mostly just absorbing the details. "This is interesting," she said when he finished. "Very interesting. The bank is essentially trying to punish you financially for social choices they disapprove of. They're using the loan call provision as a weapon to force you back into conformity with community expectations. It's discriminatory, and while it's a novel legal theory, I think we might have a case." "A case for what?" Thomas asked. "For arguing that the bank's actions constitute discrimination based on associational rights," Patricia explained. "The First Amendment protects your right to associate with whomever you choose. When a financial institution penalizes you for exercising that right, especially when the penalty is clearly motivated by social and religious pressure rather than legitimate business concerns, they're potentially violating your civil rights." She leaned forward, her expression intent. "Thomas, I'm going to be honest with you. This won't be easy. We'll be going up against the most established institution in Millbrook, backed by community support and significant resources. The discovery process will be invasive. Your entire financial history will be examined. Your relationship with Rachel will be scrutinized in ways that might be uncomfortable. And we might lose. Are you prepared for that?" Thomas thought about Rachel, about the life they were trying to build despite impossible obstacles. He thought about the Fosters and their circle of exiles, people who'd survived similar battles. He thought about his father, who taught him that standing for principle sometimes required accepting high costs. "I'm prepared," he said, "not because I'm confident we'll win, but because not fighting means accepting that financial institutions can punish people for their personal relationships. That sets a precedent I can't live with." Patricia smiled, a fierce expression that suggested she relished a good fight. "Then let's show Millbrook that discrimination has consequences, even when it's dressed up as business decisions." The lawsuit was filed the following Monday. Patricia Donovan, representing Thomas Caldwell, filed a federal civil rights complaint against Millbrook Savings and Loan, alleging discriminatory lending practices based on the plaintiff's exercise of his First Amendment right to free association. The filing requested an injunction preventing the loan from being called, compensatory damages for emotional distress and reputational harm, and punitive damages to deter similar conduct in the future. The reaction in Millbrook was immediate and explosive. The local newspaper, which had largely ignored Thomas's situation until now, ran a front-page story about the lawsuit. The headline read, "Local contractor sues bank over loan dispute. Blames discrimination." The article presented the bank's perspective prominently, quoting Douglas Pemberton's statement that the loan call was purely a business decision based on standard risk assessment criteria. Thomas's claims of discrimination were characterized as unfounded and potentially defamatory. The article made no mention of the social pressure that had prompted the bank's actions, framing the dispute as a simple disagreement between borrower and lender. The community's response divided along predictable lines. Most of Millbrook's establishment rallied behind the bank, viewing Thomas's lawsuit as an attack on a respected local institution. Pastor Hartley released a statement expressing disappointment that Thomas had chosen legal aggression rather than humble reconciliation, a barely veiled suggestion that Thomas should drop the suit and apologize for his choices. But there were also quiet voices of support. The Fosters and their circle immediately mobilized, spreading word through their networks, connecting Thomas with people who'd experienced similar treatment, building a coalition of support that existed outside Millbrook's mainstream social structures. One unexpected ally emerged in the form of James Burke, a journalist from the Nashville Tribune who specialized in investigative reporting on small-town corruption and abuse of power. James contacted Patricia after reading about the lawsuit and asked permission to do a deeper investigation into the circumstances surrounding Thomas's situation. "I've seen this pattern before," James told Thomas during their first interview. "Small towns have their own power structures, their own ways of enforcing conformity. When someone challenges those structures, the institutions close ranks and use whatever tools they have available, economic, social, religious, to bring the person back in line or drive them out entirely. Your case is a perfect example. The article James eventually published was devastating in its thoroughness. He'd interviewed dozens of Millbrook residents, both on and off the record. He'd obtained documents showing that Thomas's loan had been discussed in church leadership meetings, that Pastor Hartley had personally contacted Douglas Pemberton to express concerns about Thomas's judgment. He'd uncovered other instances where the bank had applied pressure to people who'd fallen out of favor with the church leadership. The article, titled "When Faith Becomes Financial Coercion, How One Tennessee Town Uses Banks and Churches to Enforce Social Conformity," went viral beyond Nashville, picked up by regional and eventually national news outlets. Suddenly, Thomas and Rachel's story was being discussed on legal podcasts, civil rights blogs, and even television news programs. The attention brought both benefits and costs. Patricia's legal strategy gained ammunition from the publicity, the documented connection between church leadership and bank decisions strengthening their discrimination claims. But it also made Thomas and Rachel's private struggle painfully public, their relationship analyzed and debated by strangers who felt entitled to judge their choices. Rachel struggled particularly with the sudden spotlight. Reporters tried to contact her at work, only to discover she'd been fired, which became another data point in the growing narrative of systematic persecution. Her past, David's crimes and their troubled marriage, was rehashed in articles and comment sections. Her pain commodified for public consumption. "I feel like I'm being stripped naked in public," Rachel told Thomas one evening, her voice raw with distress. "Everyone knows everything about me now. My failed marriage, my husband's crimes, my poverty, my relationship with you. There's no privacy left, no dignity. I'm just a character in a story people are arguing about." Thomas held her as she cried, feeling helpless in the face of her pain. He'd initiated the lawsuit to protect their right to build a life together, but the process was traumatizing Rachel in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. "We can stop," he said quietly. "I can drop the lawsuit, settle with the bank, accept their terms. If this is too much for you, if the cost is higher than you can bear, we can stop." Rachel pulled back and looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "And then what? They win? Everyone who's tried to punish us for caring about each other gets to keep doing it to other people. Thomas, I hate this. I hate being exposed and judged and analyzed. But I hate even more the idea that our suffering would be for nothing. If going through this might prevent someone else from experiencing what we have, then maybe it's worth it." Her courage humbled him. This woman who'd been beaten down by circumstances and cruelty for years was finding strength to fight back, not just for herself, but for others who might face similar persecution. She was transforming from victim to advocate, and Thomas felt privileged to witness it. The preliminary hearing for the injunction was scheduled for late October, 3 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. Patricia prepared Thomas extensively for his testimony, warning him that opposing counsel would try to make the case about his relationship with Rachel rather than the bank's discriminatory conduct. "They'll argue that you made poor choices, that a reasonable business would be concerned about lending to someone whose judgment is questionable," Patricia explained. "They'll try to make this about morality rather than civil rights. We need to keep refocusing on the core issue. The bank's decision was motivated by your exercise of constitutionally protected rights, not by legitimate business concerns." The hearing took place in federal court in Nashville, before Judge Martha Reynolds, a 60-year-old jurist with a reputation for no-nonsense proceedings and careful legal analysis. The courtroom was packed with observers, journalists from various outlets, members of the Foster's support network, and Thomas noted with a sinking feeling, several people from Millbrook Community Church, including Pastor Hartley himself. Patricia's opening argument was precise and powerful, laying out how Thomas's loan had been called, not due to any financial deterioration, but solely because his friendship with Rachel Brennan had made him socially unacceptable to Millbrook's power structure. She presented emails between church leaders discussing Thomas's spiritual rebellion, phone records showing calls between Pastor Hartley and Douglas Pemberton immediately before the loan call decision, and testimony from other Millbrook residents who'd faced similar financial pressure after crossing social boundaries. The bank's attorney, a polished Nashville lawyer named Richard Thornton, countered that the loan call was standard business practice when a borrower's circumstances changed in ways that affected risk assessment. He argued that Thomas's alienation from the community absolutely affected his business prospects, making him a higher credit risk. "This wasn't discrimination," Thornton insisted. "It was prudent lending policy. Mr. Caldwell made choices that damaged his professional reputation and business relationships," Thornton argued. "A bank has every right, indeed a fiduciary duty to its depositors, to reassess loans when a borrower's circumstances deteriorate. The motivation for Mr. Caldwell's reputational damage, whether we agree with the community's response or not, is irrelevant to the bank's risk calculations." When Thomas took the stand, Thornton's cross-examination was aggressive, trying to paint him as impulsive and irrational. "Mr. Caldwell, isn't it true that you've known Miss Brennan for less than 2 months?" "That's correct. And in that brief time, you've sacrificed your church community, strained your relationship with your mother, lost business connections, and now you're suing your bank. Don't these actions suggest poor judgment?" "They suggest I prioritize human decency over social approval," Thomas replied evenly. "I don't consider that poor judgment. You're in love with a married woman, Mr. Caldwell. Doesn't that constitute poor judgment by most reasonable standards?" Patricia objected immediately. "Your Honor, the nature of my client's feelings is irrelevant to whether the bank's actions were discriminatory." "Sustained," Judge Reynolds said. Mr. Thornton, keep your questions focused on the relevant issues, but the damage was done. The question planted seeds of doubt about Thomas's motivations, suggesting his lawsuit was less about civil rights and more about a man making reckless choices for romantic reasons. Rachel testified next, and Thomas watched anxiously as Thornton tried to make her the villain of the story. A woman whose moral failings, through her choice of spouse, had contaminated everyone who associated with her. Mrs. Brennan, your husband is currently serving 15 years in prison for embezzlement and fraud, correct? Yes, Rachel answered quietly. And during your marriage, you never suspected his criminal activity. Not to the extent that was revealed, no. So either you were complicit in his crimes, or you were extraordinarily unobservant about your own husband's behavior. Which is it? Objection! Patricia was on her feet. This is outrageous, Your Honor. Mrs. Brennan is not on trial here, and her husband's crimes have no bearing on whether the bank discriminated against Mr. Caldwell. Mr. Thornton, you're out of bounds, Judge Reynolds said sharply. The witness's marriage is not relevant to these proceedings. Move on or I'll hold you in contempt. But again, the point had been made. Thornton was systematically painting Rachel as damaged goods, someone whose association legitimately raised concerns about Thomas's judgment. When the hearing concluded after 2 full days of testimony and arguments, Judge Reynolds took the matter under advisement, promising a written ruling within 2 weeks. Thomas and Rachel left the courthouse exhausted, surrounded by reporters shouting questions they didn't answer. How do you think it went? Rachel asked Patricia once they were safely in the lawyer's car. Patricia was silent for a moment, considering her answer. Honestly, it could go either way. Judge Reynolds is sharp and fair, but this is novel legal territory. She'll want to be careful about setting precedent that could be misused. My gut says she'll grant the injunction, but reserve judgment on the broader questions until trial. That would give us time to build an even stronger case while protecting you from immediate financial harm. And if she doesn't grant it, Thomas asked, then you have 30 days to come up with $75,000 or lose everything you've invested in the Patterson Street project, Patricia said bluntly. Which means we'd better hope my gut is right. The 2 weeks waiting for Judge Reynolds' ruling were among the longest of Thomas's life. He tried to maintain his business, taking on smaller projects that required less capital investment while his financial future hung in uncertainty. Rachel found new employment at a small family-owned restaurant in the next county, where her notoriety hadn't yet penetrated. They leaned heavily on the Fosters community during this time, attending weekly gatherings where people shared meals and stories and provided emotional support to one another. Thomas began to understand that this network of exiles had developed its own culture, its own way of defining success and meaning outside the traditional markers of respectability and approval. We measure life differently here, Dorothy Chen explained one evening. Not by how much we accumulate or how many people approve of us, but by how authentic we can be, how courageously we can love despite risks. It's a harder way to live in some respects, but it's also more alive. The ruling arrived on a Friday afternoon. Patricia called Thomas immediately, her voice carrying both relief and caution. We got the injunction, she said. Judge Reynolds agreed that there's sufficient evidence of discriminatory conduct to warrant preventing the loan call, pending full trial. She was careful in her language, noting that this doesn't constitute a final judgment on the merits, but she said, and I quote, "The court finds troubling evidence suggesting financial institutions may have been used as tools of social coercion, a practice inconsistent with constitutional principles of free association." Thomas. This is a significant win. Thomas felt a wave of relief so powerful it left him dizzy. What happens next? Now we prepare for trial, which probably won't happen for another 6 to 8 months. We'll have extensive discovery, more depositions, and the bank will likely try to settle once they realize how much of their internal communications we're going to expose. But for now, you're safe. The loan stands as originally written, and they can't call it without another court order. After hanging up, Thomas drove immediately to Rachel's new workplace, a small Italian restaurant called Mama Rosa's. He found her in the back, rolling silverware into napkins during the slow period between lunch and dinner. When she saw his face, she set down the silverware and stood. "We won," Thomas said simply. "The injunction was granted. We won the first battle." Rachel's face crumpled, and she began crying, tears of relief and exhaustion and disbelief that anything could actually go their way. Thomas held her while she sobbed, aware that the other restaurant staff were watching but not caring. This small victory, this temporary reprieve from financial disaster, felt monumental after weeks of nothing but losses. "We're going to be okay," he whispered into her hair. "We're going to fight this thing, and even if we ultimately lose, we're going to be okay because we have each other and we have people who believe in us." Rachel nodded against his chest, unable to speak. They stood there in the restaurant's back room, surrounded by stacks of plates and the smell of garlic bread, holding on to each other and to hope that justice might actually be possible, even in a system designed to protect the powerful and punish the different. The legal battle was far from over. The trial would bring new challenges, new opportunities for their lives to be dissected and judged. But for now, they had breathing room. They had a chance to build something real, while the courts decided whether their right to do so deserved protection. And that, Thomas thought, was enough for today. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but today they had won something important, the right to keep fighting for the life they wanted to build together. 6 months after Judge Reynolds granted the injunction, the case against Millbrook Savings and Loan was scheduled for trial. But 3 weeks before the court date, something unexpected happened that would change everything. Patricia Donovan called Thomas on a Wednesday evening with news. "The bank wants to settle," she said, her tone cautious. "They're offering to reinstate your original loan terms, pay your legal fees, and provide $50,000 in damages. But there's a condition. They want a confidentiality agreement. No public statements about the settlement, no interviews discussing the case details." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "They want to buy our silence." "Essentially, yes," Patricia confirmed. "They've realized that going to trial means exposing all their internal communications, showing the documented coordination between church leadership and bank decisions. They'd rather pay you to go away quietly than face that public scrutiny. What do you think I should do?" "That's not my decision to make," Patricia said carefully. "Financially, it's a good offer. You'd be secure, able to move forward with your business. But if you were hoping this case would create broader change, would set precedent that protects others, a confidential settlement doesn't accomplish that." Thomas told her he needed time to think, to discuss it with Rachel. That evening, sitting in Rachel's small living room, they wrestled with the decision together. "Take it," Rachel said immediately. "Thomas, you've already sacrificed so much. Your church, your community standing, your relationship with your mother. Don't sacrifice your financial security too. Take the settlement. Let's just try to build a normal life. But what about the next person?" Thomas countered. "The next person in Millbrook or some other small town who gets punished for crossing social boundaries? If we settle confidentially, nothing changes. The system that hurt you, that tried to destroy us, it just continues operating the same way." Rachel was quiet for a long moment. "You're right," she said finally. "I hate that you're right, but you are. We didn't go through all this just to protect ourselves. We went through it to prove that what they did was wrong." She reached for his hand. "Turn down the settlement. Let's go to trial. Let's finish what we started." Thomas called Patricia the next morning with their decision. He could hear the smile in her voice when she responded. "I was hoping you'd say that. Let's show them what accountability looks like." But before the trial could proceed, something else happened that neither Thomas nor Rachel anticipated. It started with a knock on Thomas's door on a Sunday morning. 3 weeks before the scheduled trial date, he opened it to find Pastor Hartley standing on his porch, looking older and more uncertain than Thomas had ever seen him. The man who had always carried himself with absolute confidence now seemed diminished, almost fragile. "Thomas," the pastor said quietly. "May I come in? I need to talk to you." They sat in Thomas's living room, an awkward silence stretching between them. Finally, Pastor Hartley spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. "I've been wrong," he said simply. "About you, about Rachel, about how the church should respond to people who are suffering. I've spent 6 months watching this situation unfold, watching how the community has treated you both. And I've had to confront some uncomfortable truths about the role I played in creating that treatment." Thomas waited, saying nothing, letting the pastor continue. James Burke's article, the one that exposed how church leadership coordinated with the bank. It forced me to see how far I'd strayed from the gospel I claimed to preach. I'd convinced myself that maintaining the church's reputation and enforcing social standards was godly leadership. But what I was actually doing was wielding power to punish people who didn't conform to my expectations. Pastor Hartley's eyes were wet. "Catherine has been seeing a counselor, trying to process her feelings about you choosing Rachel. In those sessions, she's had to confront how much of her identity was wrapped up in being the perfect pastor's daughter, in living up to impossible standards. She told me last week that she's grateful you didn't choose her, because you showed her that authentic love means accepting someone's flaws, not requiring them to perform perfection." He paused, struggling with his next words. "I've called a special meeting with the church elders. I'm resigning as senior pastor, effective immediately. The church needs leadership that prioritizes compassion over control, grace over judgment. I'm not that leader anymore, if I ever truly was." Thomas felt a complex mixture of emotions, vindication, sadness, and something like pity for this man who'd lost his way, while genuinely believing he was serving God. "What will you do?" Thomas asked. "I don't know yet," Pastor Hartley admitted. "Maybe that's appropriate. Maybe I need to spend time not being in charge, not having answers, just wrestling with what I actually believe versus what I've been performing." He looked at Thomas directly. "I came here to apologize, to you and through you to Rachel. I was cruel to her when she needed a shepherd. I was manipulative with you when you needed a mentor. I'm deeply sorry. I accept your apology," Thomas said quietly. "And I hope you find whatever you're looking for in this next season." After the pastor left, Thomas sat alone for a long time, processing the encounter. Part of him felt satisfaction that Pastor Hartley had finally seen the harm his leadership had caused. But another part felt only sadness at how much pain could have been avoided if the man had chosen compassion from the beginning. The news of Pastor Hartley's resignation rippled through Millbrook like an earthquake. The church leadership initially tried to frame it as a sabbatical, but the pastor himself insisted on honesty, releasing a statement that acknowledged his failures and urged the congregation to examine how they'd treated the vulnerable among them. The response was mixed. Some members were defensive, refusing to accept that their beloved pastor had done anything wrong. Others began questioning their own participation in ostracizing Thomas and Rachel. A few brave souls even reached out to apologize directly. Eleanor Caldwell, Thomas's mother, called him 2 days after the pastor's resignation. "I've been talking to Margaret Foster," she said without preamble. "She told me about her daughter Emily, about what happened to their family 15 years ago. I didn't know, Thomas. I didn't realize the pattern had been happening for so long." "Mom, let me finish," Eleanor interrupted. "I've been a coward. I chose social acceptance over supporting my own son. I let fear of judgment override my love for you. Margaret helped me see that clearly, and I'm ashamed. Can you forgive me?" Thomas felt tears burning in his eyes. "Of course I can. Mom, I never stopped loving you. I just needed you to trust me. I'd like to meet Rachel," Eleanor said. "Properly, not just seeing her at church. I'd like to invite you both for dinner, to get to know the woman who's been important enough to you that you'd risk everything." The dinner happened the following week. Rachel was nervous, wearing her nicest dress and clutching a bouquet of flowers she'd insisted on bringing. Eleanor Caldwell welcomed them with a warmth that felt genuine, not performed. Over pot roast that reminded Thomas of his childhood, the three of them talked. Eleanor asked Rachel about her life before David's arrest, about her parents, her dreams. Rachel spoke hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as she realized Eleanor's interest was authentic. "I see why my son loves you," Eleanor said toward the end of the evening. "You have a strength that comes from surviving things that would have destroyed many people. And you've helped Thomas become more fully himself than I've seen him in years. I'm grateful for that, even if it's taken me too long to say so," Rachel cried quietly. Overwhelmed by acceptance she'd stopped believing was possible. The trial date arrived, with the case taking an unexpected turn. During jury selection, Richard Thornton, the bank's attorney, requested a conference with Patricia and the judge. In chambers, he announced that Millbrook Savings and Loan wanted to settle publicly this time, with no confidentiality requirement. "My clients have reassessed their position," Thornton said stiffly. "They're willing to acknowledge that their loan call decision was improperly influenced by non-financial considerations. They'll reinstate the original loan terms, pay all legal fees and court costs, provide $75,000 in compensatory damages, and make a public statement acknowledging their error." "Why the change?" Patricia asked skeptically. "Pastor Hartley's resignation and public statement has shifted community sentiment," Thornton admitted. "Continuing this fight no longer serves the bank's interests. They'd prefer to settle with dignity rather than lose at trial." The settlement was finalized that afternoon. Judge Reynolds praised both parties for reaching a resolution that acknowledged wrongdoing while allowing everyone to move forward. Outside the courthouse, Thomas and Rachel faced a cluster of reporters. For once, Thomas didn't deflect their questions. "What we experienced wasn't unique," he said. "Small communities everywhere use social and economic pressure to enforce conformity. People lose jobs, loans, friendships, church homes because they make choices that others disapprove of. This settlement doesn't fix that system, but maybe it sends a message that there are costs to discrimination. Even when it's dressed up as propriety or righteousness," a reporter asked Rachel what she planned to do next. "Live my life," Rachel said simply. "Without shame, without apology for existing. That's revolutionary enough in a place like Millbrook." 6 months later, on a crisp spring morning, Thomas and Rachel stood before Judge Patricia Morrison in family court. Rachel's divorce from David Brennan had finally been granted, the process expedited by David's acknowledgement that the marriage was irretrievably broken and his waiver of any rights to contest the proceedings. 3 months after that, on a perfect June afternoon, Thomas and Rachel were married in the backyard of the foster home, surrounded by the community of exiles who'd supported them through their darkest times. Margaret Foster officiated, having obtained credentials specifically for this purpose. Eleanor Caldwell sat in the front row, crying happy tears. The ceremony was simple, filled with honest vows about choosing each other daily, about building a life based on authenticity rather than performance. When Thomas kissed his bride, the small gathering erupted in applause. Millbrook Community Church had a new pastor by then, a younger man named David Chen, who preached about radical inclusion and second chances. Some members had left, uncomfortable with the shift. But others, including Catherine Hartley, who now worked as a counselor at a domestic violence shelter, stayed and helped build something different. Thomas's business recovered and eventually thrived. His reputation rebuilt not on social conformity, but on integrity and skill. Rachel finished her teaching degree at the community college, eventually landing a position at the elementary school in the next county. They remained active in the Foster's community, which continued to grow as more people found their way out of rigid systems and into more authentic ways of living. The island of misfit toys became a lifeline for those who didn't fit conventional molds. Years later, when people asked Thomas if he regretted his choice to defend the cursed widow, he would smile and pull Rachel close. "I regret nothing," he'd say. "Choosing her was choosing myself. It was choosing truth over performance, love over approval, courage over comfort. Those are choices I'll never regret. And Rachel, who'd once asked, "Why me?" in disbelief that anyone would choose her, finally understood the answer. Not because she was perfect or uncomplicated or easy, but because love, real love, doesn't calculate costs or measure worth by social acceptability. It simply chooses and keeps choosing, regardless of what that choice demands. Their story became the kind that people whispered about in Millbrook for years, though the telling changed depending on who was speaking. Some saw it as cautionary tale about rebellion's consequences. Others saw it as evidence that authentic love could survive systematic opposition. But Thomas and Rachel didn't much care about the interpretations. They were too busy living the life they'd fought for, one honest day at a time, proving that sometimes the cursed are just the ones brave enough to reject curses they never deserved. And that's a kind of blessing all its own. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.